Proposition 6. Nomad existence necessarily implies the numerical elements of a war machine. Tens, hundreds, thousands, myriads, all armies retain these decimal groupings to the point that each time they are encountered it is safe to assume the presence of a military organization. Is this not the way an army deterritorializes its soldiers? An army is composed of units, companies, divisions. The numbers can vary in function, in combination. They can enter into entirely different strategies, but there is always a connection between the number and the war machine. It is not a question of quantity, but of organization or composition. When the state creates armies, it always applies the principle of numerical organization, but all it does is adopt the principle, at the same time as it appropriates the war machine. For so peculiar an idea, the numerical organization of people, came to the nomads. It was the Hyksos, conquering nomads, who brought it to Egypt, and when Moses applied it to his people in Exodus, it was on the advice of his nomad father-in-law, Jethro the Kenite, and was done in such a way as to constitute a war machine, the elements of which are described in the Book of Numbers. The nomos is fundamentally numerical, arithmetic. When Greek geometrism is contrasted with Indo-Arab arithmetism, it becomes clear that the latter implies a nomos opposable to the logos. Not that the nomads do arithmetic or algebra, but because arithmetic and algebra arise in a strongly nomad-influenced world. Up to now we have known three major types of human organization: lineal, territorial, and numerical. Lineal organization allows us to define so-called primitive societies. Clan lineages are essentially segments in action. They meld and divide and vary according to their ancestor considered, the tasks and the circumstances. Of course, number plays an important role in the determination of lineage or in the creation of new lineages, as does the earth, since a clan segmentarity is doubled by a tribal segmentarity. The earth is, before all else, the matter upon which the dynamic of lineages is inscribed, and the number, a means of inscription. The lineages write upon the earth, and with the number, constituting a kind of geodesy. Reader's note, I assume that's a neologism. It's spelt Geodesy. Geodesy. Everything changes with state societies. It is often said that the territorial principle becomes dominant. One could also speak of deterritorialization, since the earth becomes an object, instead of being an active material element in combination with lineage. Property is precisely the deterritorialized relation between the human being and the earth. This is so whether property constitutes a good belonging to the state, superimposed upon continuing possession by a lineal community, or whether it itself becomes a good belonging to private individuals, constituting a new community. In both cases, and according to the two poles of the state, something like an overcoding of the earth replaces geodesy. Of course, lineages remain very important and numbers take on their own importance, but what moves to the forefront is a territorial organization, in the sense that all the segments, whether of lineage, land, or number, are taken up by an astronomical space, or a geometrical extension that overcodes them. But certainly not in the same way in the archaic imperial state and in modern states. The archaic state envelops a spatium with a summit, a differentiated space with depth and levels, while modern states, beginning with the Greek city-state, develop a homogeneous extensio with an immanent character, an immanent centre, divisible homologous parts, and symmetrical and reversal relations. again, reversible relations. Not only do the two models, the astronomical and the geometrical, enter into intimate mixes, but even when they are supposedly pure, both imply the subordination of lineages and numbers to this metric power, puissance, as it appears either in the imperial spatium or in the political extensio. Arithmetic, the number, have always had a decisive role in the state apparatus. This is so even as early as the imperial bureaucracy, with the three conjoined operations of the census, taxation, and election. It is even more true of modern forms of the state, which, in developing, utilized all the calculation techniques that were springing up at the border between mathematical science and social technology. There is a whole social calculus at the basis of political economy, demography, the organization of work, etc. This arithmetic element of the state found its specific power in the treatment of all kinds of matter, primary matters, raw materials, the secondary matter of worked objects, or the ultimate matter constituted by the human population. Thus the number has always served to gain mastery over matter, to control its variations and movements. In other words, to submit them to the spatio-temporal framework of the state, either the imperial spatium or the modern extensio. The state has a territorial principle, or a principle of deterritorialization that links the number to metric magnitudes, taking into account the increasingly complex metrics operating the overcoding. We do not believe that the conditions of independence or autonomy of the number are to be found in the state, even though all the factors of its development are present. The numbering number, nombrant, in other words, autonomous arithmetic organization, implies neither a superior degree of abstraction nor very large quantities. It relates only to conditions of possibility constituted by nomadism, and to conditions of effectuation constituted by the war machine. It is in state armies that the problem of the treatment of large quantities arise in relation to other matters. But the war machine operates with small quantities that it appears using numbering numbers. These numbers appear as soon as one distributes something in space, instead of dividing up space or distributing space itself. The number becomes a subject. The independence of the number in relation to space is not a result of abstraction, but of the concrete nature of smooth space, which is occupied without itself being counted. The number is no longer a means of counting or measuring, but of moving. It is the number itself that moves through smooth space. There is undoubtedly a geometry of smooth space, but as we have seen, it is a minor operative geometry, a geometry of the trait. The more independent space is from a matrix, the more independent the number is from space. Geometry as a royal science has little importance for the war machine. Its only importance is in state armies, and for sedentary fortification, but it leads generals to serious defeats. The number becomes a principle whenever it occupies a smooth space, and is deployed within it as subject instead of measuring a striated space. The number is the mobile occupant, the movable, mobile, in smooth space, as opposed to the geometry of the immovable, immobile, in striated space. The nomadic numerical unit is the ambulant fire, and not the tent, which is still too much of an immovable. Quote, the fire takes precedence over the yurt. End quote. The numbering number is no longer subordinated to metric determinations or geometrical dimensions, but has only a dynamic relation with geographical directions. It is a directional number, not a dimensional or metric one. Nomad organization is indissolubly arithmetic and directional. Quantity is everywhere. Tens, hundreds. Direction is everywhere. Left, right. The numerical chief is also the chief of the left or the right. The numbering number is rhythmic, not harmonic. It is not related to cadence or measure. It is only in state armies and for reasons of discipline and show that one marches in cadence. But autonomous numerical organization finds its meaning elsewhere whenever it is necessary to establish an order of displacement on the steppe, the desert, at the point where the lineages of the forest dwellers and the figures of the state lose their relevance. Quote, "He moved with the random walk which made only those sounds natural to the desert. Nothing in his passage would indicate that human flesh moved there. It was a way of walking so deeply conditioned in him that he didn't need to think about it. The feet moved of themselves, no measurable rhythm to the pacing." End quote. In the war machine and nomadic existence, the number is no longer numbered, nombre, but becomes a cipher, chiffre, and it is in this capacity that it constitutes the esprit de corps and invents the secret and its outgrowths: strategy, espionage, war ruses, ambush, diplomacy, etc. A ciphered, rhythmic, directional, autonomous, movable, numbering number. The war machine is like the necessary consequence of nomadic organization. Moses experienced it with all its consequences. Some people nowadays are too eager to criticize this numerical organization, denouncing it as a military or even concentration camp society where people are no longer anything more than deterritorialized numbers, numeros. But that is false. Horror for horror, the numerical organization of people is certainly no crueler than the lineal or state organizations. Treating people like numbers is not necessarily worse than treating them like trees to prune or geometrical figures to contour and model. Moreover, the use of the number as a numeral, as a statistical element, is proper to the numbered number of the state, not to the numbering number. In the world of the concentration camp operates as much by lineages and territories as by numeration. The question is not one of good or bad, but of specificity. The specificity of numerical organization comes from the nomadic mode of existence and the war machine function. The numbering number is distinct both from lineal codes and state overcoding. Arithmetic composition on the one hand selects, extracts from the lineages the elements that will enter into nomadism in the war machine, and on the other hand directs them against the state apparatus, opposing a machine and an existence to the state apparatus, tracing a deterritorialization that traverses both the lineal territorialities and the territory or deterritoriality of the state. The first characteristic of the numbering, nomadic or war, number is that it is always complex, that is articulated. A complex of numbers every time. It is exactly for this reason that it in no way implies large homogenized quantities. Like state numbers or the numbered number, but rather produces its effect of immensity by its fine articulation. In other words, by its distribution of heterogeneity in a free space. Even state armies do not do away with this principle when they deal with large numbers, despite the predominance of base 10. The Roman legion was a number made up of numbers, articulated in such a way that the segments became mobile, and the figures geometrical, changing, transformational. The complex or articulated number does not only comprise men, but also weapons, animals, and vehicles. The arithmetic base unit is therefore a unit of assemblage. For example, man, horse, bow. 1 by 1 by 1, according to the formula that carried the Scythians to triumph. And the formula becomes more complicated to the extent that certain weapons assemble or articulate several men or animals, as in the case of the chariot with 2 horses and 2 men, one to drive, the other to throw. 2 by 1 by 2 equals 1. Or in the case of the famous 2-handled shield of the hoplite reform, which soldered together human chains. However small the unit it is articulated, the numbering number always has several bases at the same time. It is also necessary to take into account arithmetic relations that are external, yet still contained in the number, expressing the proportion of combatants among the members of a lineage or tribe, the role of reserves and stocks, the upkeep of people, things and animals. Logistics is the part of these external relations, which are no less a part of the war machine than the internal relations of strategy. In other words, the composition of combat units in relation to one another. The two together constitute the science of the articulation of numbers of war. Every assemblage has this strategic aspect and this logistical aspect. But the numbering number has a second, more secret characteristic. Everywhere the war machine displays a curious process of arithmetic replication or doubling, as if it operated along 2 non-symmetrical and non-equal series. On the one hand, the lineages are indeed organized and reshuffled numerically. A numerical composition is superimposed upon the lineages in order to make the new principle prevail. But on the other hand, men are simultaneously extracted from each lineage to form a special numerical body, as if the new numerical composition of the lineage body could not succeed without the constitution of the body proper to it, itself numerical. We believe that this is not an accidental phenomenon, but an essential constituent of the war machine, a necessary operation for the autonomy of the number. The number of the body must have as its correlate a body of the number. The number must be doubled according to 2 complementary operations. For the social body to be numerized, the number must form a special body. When Genghis Khan undertook his great composition of the steppe, he numerically organized the lineages and the fighters in each lineage, placing them under a cipher and a chief. Groups of 10 with decurions, groups of 100 with centurions, groups of 1,000 with chiliarchs. But he also extracted from each arithmetized lineage a small number of men who were to constitute his personal guard. In other words, a dynamic formation comprising a staff, commissars, messengers and diplomats, and tristians. One is never without the other. A double deterritorialization, the second of which is to a higher power, puissance. When Moses undertook his great composition of the desert, where the influence he felt from the nomads was necessarily stronger than that of Yahweh, he took a census of each tribe and organized them numerically. But he also decreed a law according to which the firstborn of each tribe at that particular time belonged by right to Yahweh, as these firstborn were obviously still too young. Their role in the number was transferred to a special tribe, that of the Levites, who provided the body of the number, or the special guard of the ark. And as the Levites were less numerous than the new firstborn of the tribes taken together, the excess firstborn had to be brought back by the tribes in the form of taxes, bringing us back to a fundamental aspect of logistics. The war machine would be unable to function without this double series. It is necessary both that numerical composition replace lineal composition, and that it conjure away the territorial organization of the state. Power in the war machine is defined according to this double series. Power is no longer based on segments and centers, on the potential resonance of centers and overcoding of segments, but on these relations internal to the number and independent of quantity. Tensions or power struggles are also a result of this, between Moses' tribes and the Levites, between Genghis's Noyans and Antristians. This is not simply a protest on the part of the lineages, wishing to regain their former autonomy, nor is it the prefiguration of a struggle for control over a state apparatus. It is a tension inherent in the war machine, in its special power, and in the particular limitations placed on the power, puissance, of the chief. Thus, numerical composition, or the numbering number, implies several operations. The arithmetization of the starting aggregates, or sets, the lineages, the union of the extracted subsets, the constitution of the groups of 10, 100, etc., the formation by substitution of another set in correspondence with the united set, the special body. It is this last operation that implies the most variety and originality in nomad existence. The same problem arises even in state armies when the war machine is appropriated by the state. In effect, if the arithmetization of the social body has as its correlate the formation of a distinct special body, itself arithmetic, this special body may be constructed in several ways. 1. From a privileged lineage or tribe, the dominance of which subsequently takes on a new meaning, the case of Moses with the Levites. 2. From representatives of each lineage who subsequently serve also as hostages, the firstborn. This would actually be the Asian case, or the case of Genghis. 3. From a totally different element, one exterior to the base society, slaves, foreigners, or people of another religion. This was already the case as early as the Saxon regime, in which the king used Frankish slaves to compose his special body. But Islam is the prime example, even inspiring a specific sociological category, that of military slavery. The Mamelukes of Egypt, slaves from the steppe or the Caucasus who were purchased at the very early age by the Sultan, or the Ottoman Janissaries who came from Christian communities. Is this not the origin of an important theme, the nomad as child stealers? It's easy to see, especially in the last example, how the special body is instituted as an element determinant of power in the war machine. The war machine and nomadic existence have to conjure away two things simultaneously: the return of the lineal aristocracy, but also the formation of imperial functionaries. What complicates everything is that the state itself has often been determined in such a way as to use slaves as high functionaries. As we shall see, the reasons this was done varied, and that although the two currents conjoined in armies, they came from two distinct sources. For the power of slaves, foreigners, or captives in a war machine of nomadic origin is very different from the power of lineal aristocracies, but also from that of state functionaries and bureaucrats. They are commissars, emissaries, diplomats, spies, strategists, logisticians, sometimes smiths. They cannot be explained away as a quote-unquote whim of the Sultan. On the contrary, it is the possibility of the war chief having whims that is explained by the objective existence and necessity of the special numerical body. This cipher has the value only in relation to a nomos. There is both a deterritorialization and a becoming proper to the war machine. The special body, in particular the slave infidel foreigner, is the one who becomes a soldier and believer while remaining deterritorialized in relation to the lineages and the state. You have to be born an infidel to become a believer. You have to be born a slave to become a soldier. Specifically, schools or institutions are needed for this purpose. The special body is an invention proper to the war machine, which states always use, adapting it so totally to their own ends that it becomes unrecognizable. Or, restituting it in bureaucratic staff form, or in the technocratic form of very special bodies, or in esprit de corps that serve the state as much as they resist it, or among the commissioners who double the state as much as they serve it. It is true that the nomads have no history, they only have a geography, and the defeat of the nomads was so complete, that history is one with the triumph of states. We have witnessed, as a result, a generalized critique dismissing the nomads as incapable of any innovation, whether technological or metallurgical, political or metaphysical. Historians, bourgeois or Soviet, Rousseau or Vladimirtsov, consider the nomads a pitiable segment of humanity that understands nothing, not technology, to which it supposedly remains indifferent, not agriculture, not the cities and states it destroyed or conquered. It is difficult to see, however, how the nomads could have triumphed in war if they did not possess strong metallurgical capabilities. The idea that the nomad received his technical weapons and political counselling from renegades from an imperial state is highly improbable. It is difficult to see how the nomads could have undertaken to destroy cities and states, except in the name of nomad organisation, and a war machine defined not by ignorance, but by their positive characteristics, by their specific space, by a composition all their own that broke the lineages and conjured away the state form. History has always dismissed the nomads. Attempts have been made to apply a properly military category to the war machine, that of military democracy, and a properly sedentary category to nomadism, that of feudalism. But these two hypotheses presuppose a territorial principle, either that an imperial state appropriates the war machine, distributing land to warriors as a benefit of their position, kleroi and false fiefs, or that property, once it has become private, in itself posits relations of dependence among the property owners constituting the army, true fiefs and vassalage. In both cases, the number is subordinated to an immobile fiscal organisation in order to establish which land can be or has been ceded, as well as to fix the taxes owed by the beneficiaries themselves. There is no doubt that nomad organisation and the war machine deal with these same problems, both at the level of land and that of taxation, in which the nomadic warriors were great innovators, despite what is said to the contrary. But they invent a territoriality and a movable fiscal organisation that testifies to the autonomy of a numerical principle. There can be a confusion or combination of the systems, but the specificity of the nomadic system remains the subordination of land to numbers that are displaced and deployed, and of taxation to relations internal to those numbers. Already with Moses, for example, taxation played a role in the relation between the numerical bodies and the special body of the number. In short, military democracy and feudalism, far from explaining the numerical composition of the nomads, instead testifies to what may survive of it in sedentary regimes.